Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 21st, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And I want to thank you all for your birthday wishes, those of you who sent them to me. The big 4-1 this weekend. Thanks for your support in all these endeavors and 10 years of podcasting. It's been a wonderful time. And as always, before we get into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I have the bandwidth to keep doing it. And the way we keep it going is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support for the time being, still on a per episode basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Krister Jansen, Anu Badavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Thomas Sadovich, Gabriel F. Jaramillo, Brian Holden, Chuck Blale, David Compton, Eric Sole Hogsbo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Susana Monsó. She is an associate professor of philosophy in the Department of Logic, History, and Philosophy of Science at the National Distance Education University in Madrid. She works in both the philosophy of animal minds and animal ethics, and she has a new book called Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Susana Monsó. Well, Susana, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
When your book came across my desk, Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death, I had to get you on the show. As many listeners know now, this transition in my life as a psychologist and researcher has been into sort of the world of end of life with human beings and how we grapple with the concept of death. And so I was like, oh, what a fun and interesting topic to grapple with, given like where I'm coming from, given where you're coming from. So I'm just so glad to be having this conversation with you.
Awesome.
So tell me a little about yourself. Before we get into the topic of the book, I'd love to hear about the work that you do, because you are a philosopher, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I studied philosophy at a very old-fashioned university in Madrid, where the BA degree, which was 5 years at the time, so it was very long, but it was mostly, I would say it was pretty much all of it was just studying the history of Western male white philosophy pre-1950s. So it was all like, what old white dudes said in the past. And there wasn't any talk about real world problems. And in fact, there was this kind of a dogma in that university at the time that philosophy should not talk about the real world because it becomes corrupt if it does. Like, pure philosophy is the love of wisdom, just purely for the sake of wisdom. So you can't have like any ulterior motives why you want to do philosophy. And that always kind of sat uncomfortably with me. And I guess I've always had a bit of a rebellious streak in me. So after I finished that, I went to London to do a master's in global ethics, which is like the complete opposite thing. It's like really trying to use philosophy to grapple with real world problems. And at the time, I became vegetarian when I was in London, and I had been like thinking about making the transition for a long time. And I was very, very bonded with my dog at that time. He was already like 5 or 6 years old, and we were very, very close. So he sort of made me think a lot about animals and think about the animals I was eating. And it just like opened up this whole world of animal minds. Like my dog was he was a wire-haired dachshund, and this breed usually has like very, very stubborn nature to them. So if you're around a wire-haired dachshund, you won't have any doubt whatsoever that they have a mind, that they have a personality. You cannot get them to do whatever they don't want to do. So yeah, I loved him to death. He's still the love of my life. Sadly, he passed away in 2020, but
that's so
he made me
hard.
think. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But he made me think a lot about animals. And so I decided to do my MA thesis on animal ethics. And I read the seminal texts during that time, Peter Singer, Tom Regan, these authors who started the conversation on animal ethics. And I felt that they weren't quite satisfying because they kept building all these theories about what we owe to other animals that were dependent on the psychological capacities that animals had. So, for instance, Peter Singer will say, we owe this to animals because they are sentient. And Tom Regan would say, we owe it to them because they're subjects of a life, where being a subject of a life means having all these psychological capacities. But they never really engaged with the scientific literature on animal minds. They just sort of like speculated about what they thought the distribution of these cognitive capacities would be in nature. And I always thought this kind of weakened the theories. And I decided that if I wanted to do good animal ethics, I needed to first learn about the animal mind, or like at least understand animals as well as I could. And so I went into philosophy of animal minds during my PhD. And that's mostly where I've stayed since then. Most of my writing has been on animal minds, but I always, like, ethics is always in the back of my mind. I always think of myself as doing animal minds for animal ethics.
When you studied for your PhD in sort of focusing on the animal mind, was this a like welcome topic in your department, or were people like, that's a weird thing to study? Like how was it received?
No, it was totally weird. They
Okay.
called me Monkey Girl. I was Monkey Girl for my PhD. Like, I mean, my colleagues, they were wonderful. I work with them now because I went away for a few years, but then I went back to the same department, and I love them. But they did think that that it was a silly topic, and they didn't really take it very seriously. And there were a lot of jokes about it. Now I'm still Monkey Girl, but it's kind of different because I've sort of earned a reputation, more or less. So I'm like reputable Monkey Girl.
Do you find that there are others sort of scattershot around the world who have similar or aligned interests through that philosophical lens? Because obviously, you often will hear about individuals who study animal cognition, like through a psychology perspective. But this idea of the philosophy of the animal mind and of ethics involving animals, is that becoming a bigger field, or is it still kind of like, oh, that person over there kind of gets it, and I sometimes collaborate with that one over there?
Yeah, so I think it's important to distinguish philosophy of animal minds and animal ethics, because I like move within both disciplines, and I think of myself as working across both of them, but they are very separate disciplines that operate in very encapsulated ways. There's not a lot of dialogue um, among the two of them. And animal ethics is pretty well established as a discipline. There are even like whole MA programs on animal ethics or environmental ethics, which like a big part of it is going to be animal ethics. And I believe there are also like chairs in animal ethics and so on. Like it is quite a big topic, a big discipline. And I know a lot of people who work just on animal ethics. Whereas philosophy of animal minds is a much more minor discipline. It's much younger, and there aren't that many people working on this. And the people who are working on it typically are also working in other disciplines. Like they might be working in animal ethics like I do, or in like philosophy of biology or philosophy of science. And but it's not such a well-established discipline because it's still very young. And typically, like, for instance, it's very common to see job adverts like for postdocs and so on in animal ethics, whereas in philosophy of animal minds they are very rare. And it's very rare to have university courses on philosophy of animal minds and so on. But there are people, and some of us are we're really sort of fighting to establish discipline. So together with Kristen Andrews, Colin Allen, Laurie Gruen, and Richard Moore, we co-founded the Philosophy of Animal Minds and Behavior Association, PAMBA, which had its first meeting last year in Madrid, and it's having its next meeting next year in California. And we're very excited about that. And what we're seeing with PAMBA is that there is more interest now than there was 10 years ago. Like when we did the meeting in Madrid, we got an insane number of proposals for when we did our call for papers. So many young PhD students or early postdocs sent in their proposals, and it was really exciting to see that it's growing. There's a lot of interest in the topic.
No, it's very cool. I can't help but feel in some ways aligned and inspired by the kind of road paving that you're doing, because I often struggle in my own field in psychology, where I have this great interest in end of life, but I have to approach it very often through like gerontology or through psycho-oncology, or when I do attend end of life trainings or symposia, very often I'm the only or one of a very few psychologists there, and it's mostly chaplains and social workers and physicians and kind of other disciplines. So it's always really interesting when you have this this focus of your work that is so multidisciplinary, but you have to choose a discipline, and then you've got to work within that discipline.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So I want to know, before we get into animals' conception of death or understanding of death, what are some other types of topics that you research when it comes to the animal mind? What kinds of things are you grappling with?
Yeah, so I am very interested in those capacities that we usually use to separate humans from animals. So I did my PhD on the topic of animal morality. So it's the question of it's different from animal ethics. It's about not about our treatment of animals, but about how animals themselves behave and whether their behavior qualifies as moral.
Oh, so like those studies where, will they share the food and then they get more food? And yeah. Okay.
That's that
Interesting.
sort of stuff. So like altruism, empathy, rescue behavior, etc., etc. So I did my PhD on that, and I've worked quite a lot on that topic. Um, I've also been working a little bit on rationality in animals, which is also like traditionally humans have been described as the rational animals. So it is something that we have used to separate ourselves from other species. I've also recently started a project on animal medicine. So these not veterinary care, but rather behaviors of animals that are self-healing or other healing, when they will self-medicate or attend to others' wounds, etc.
Oh,
So
it's
I'm interested in
fascinating. And
yeah.
even psychoactive substance use too, right? Because a fair amount of animals have been observed to like trip, to like
Yeah,
go on
yeah,
a
that
little
is
trip. Yeah.
actually I've never thought of that as an example of medicine, but I guess it is in a way.
Right. Self-medicating just for maybe for recreational purposes.
Yeah. No, it's actually very interesting, this topic, because it makes you really think about what we tend to think of as part of medicine. So for instance, there's like a handful of studies documenting primates helping other primates give birth.
Yeah.
And this is not really like, it's not part of the animal medication or medicine literature at all. It goes separately, but it is kind of like also a medical intervention of sorts, to
Absolutely. Like
right?
midwifery. That's amazing.
Exactly, exactly. So like animal stripping might be also that kind of thing, that it's not usually thought of as an example of medication, but actually in a way they are also like somehow affecting their own mental well-being in a way.
Right. Oh, it's fascinating. Oh, what a cool job you have.
Thank you.
So, what brought you then? I mean, obviously, it kind of sounds like it's in keeping with this larger theme of interest that you have, which is what have we historically thought of that separates us from our animal selves? We are animals, obviously, and we've often kind of, I think, in the sort of like speaking to the white men's philosophical literature, said like we are but human animal. We are different. We are better. We are somehow more evolved. And so identifying these examples of like, I don't know, I love, reading about different gender dynamics and different sexual orientations and reading about self-medicating and healing wounds. What brought you to that place where you really wanted to talk about the contemplation or the understanding of mortality?
So there are two sides to my answer here. So there's kind of like an academic story, and then there's more of a personal story. So academically speaking, I was sort of at the beginning of my postdoc years, and I needed a different topic to work on to apply for some external funding to be able to continue with having a job basically. And so it's kind of important to look for a topic that's not the one that you did your PhD on, because you want to be able to show that you can, do good work on different topics. And um, so at the time, I mean, I'm always sort of monitoring the latest scientific evidence on animal minds. I actually have a mailing list where I share the latest papers in case any of your listeners are interested. Um, and I had been following, you know, the emergence of a series of reports on animals' reactions to death that had been sort of like, appearing here and there, but seemed to be like gaining momentum. Like it seemed to be an emerging field, an emerging topic, this comparative thanatology. But it was very young. And so I felt it was kind of like a good debate to intervene in as a philosopher, because um, you know when a scientific discipline is very young, it's usually in need of some conceptual clarification, like helping to delineate exactly what we're studying and how are we understanding the key terms and so on. And that's the sort of thing that philosophers are good at. So that's like the academic story. But also, like on a more personal level, I was close to turning 30 at the time. And I think this is something that's quite a common phenomenon, because I've heard about a bunch of other people going through something similar. I became really obsessed with death, like really, really obsessed with the idea that I was going to die. And I was like really like struggling with accepting that fact, like integrating it into my reality. I think it has something to do with like, officially becoming an adult or something, that you're
Yeah. And I
suddenly.
think looking back and saying, I have lived this many years, I may only live the same amount of years in the future. Like that halfway point. And 30 is a bit young now, but it used to be the halfway point.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
41 in a couple of weeks. Actually, as of this airing, I will have already turned 41. Yeah, I'm right there with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think any change of decade is kind of, a big deal in these terms. It does confront you with mortality. Um, so so I became very obsessed with that. And at the time, the fact that I applied for this project and I was doing this research seemed completely unrelated. It was only like with time and distance that I realized, oh, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense that I was looking for these answers, like I was trying to find some peace, and I would like trying to make peace with the fact that I was mortal. And it seemed, I think I'm very analytical, and I'm very like, I like to think things through, and I come to terms with, hard facts by like thinking them through. And I think at that time, it was important for me to like really think about death for a while and look at it from all angles and so on. And yeah, so I think that's part of the motivation.
Yeah, and so how do you even begin to approach something like that?
The way I tend to go about my research is I always start from the animals, because some people, like some philosophers, will tend to start from the philosophy and then maybe look at the animals. And I think that that's a bit dangerous, because once you kind of buy a philosophical theory, it can be like very difficult to like change your mind. And I think if we are theorizing about animal minds, we need to start from the animals. So the first thing that I did was I read all of the literature that there was on this topic, like every single empirical report. And that's where I started from. And yeah, that's usually how I operate. I read first a lot about animals, and then I start thinking, okay, what philosophical insights can I make here? Like, what philosophical tools can I bring? And also, I'm very interested in like how scientists are analyzing the data and the sort of narratives that they're constructing. I look very carefully at um, the words that scientists use. And I have a friend who's an animal welfare scientist, and once like we wrote a paper together, and she saw how I read scientific papers, and she was like, "We're not writing." With that much care for you to read us with so much detail. I
Right.
think they're not used to using their words as carefully as a philosopher would use them.
So sort of those logical leaps that are made between, okay, this, therefore this, you're really going in and like breaking that down.
Exactly. Or like, how are they using this term? Like, how many different senses are they using it in? Or, you know, so I'm very interested in that. And I'm always interested in like how they're using their terms, how like whether there are any biases in how the data are being interpreted, anything that's been like any philosophical presuppositions that have been creeping in and that the scientists haven't maybe being so aware of, which is normal because it's not part of their training. It's not part of it's not the way of thinking that they're used to. um, so yeah, that's how I usually operate.
Oh, it's fascinating. And then what kinds of questions do you go about sort of asking? You're basically just looking at the literature, digging deeper and deeper into the literature. Are you ever asking questions that either haven't been studied or that the literature is pretty sparse on? And I don't know, and trying to uh, understand by reading between the lines?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things. I guess when you do like this kind of literature review, you obviously locate like places where we're missing data. um and you also like really reflect a lot on how the terms are being used. So for me, like I approached this topic initially, I had two like big questions in mind, because I wanted to address the question of whether animals can understand death. And so like the first question was, what does it mean to understand death? Which is a typical philosophical question. Philosophers love to do this. Philosopher will always respond to a question by saying, well, it depends on what you mean. And so like the first thing was like, what does it mean to understand death? And then once that part was clear, can animals understand death? And this can thing is an important aspect of this question, because scientists, they tend to stick a lot with like the evidence that we actually have, and how much can we say with the evidence. And so they might answer the question like, or like the question they might pose would be probably something like, do we have any evidence that animals understand death? That's how a scientist might pose it. But a philosopher might ask, can animals understand death? And why is this important? Well, because like a philosopher, when we're analyzing what it means to understand death, we're not just like characterizing um, a psychological ability, but we're also thinking about the cognitive prerequisites. Like what sort of psychological architecture needs to be in place for someone to reach a concept of death, for someone to develop a concept of death. And once you know that, you can kind of like go back to the literature and speculate um, in a sort of like theoretically driven, but also like empirically driven way. So it's not like completely like armchair speculation. It's really it is at least in part driven by the data, but you can speculate about like how extended you can expect that capacity to be. If it's presupposing, say for example, we were to determine that a concept of death requires a theory of mind, which I don't believe, but some people have defended, then you could look already at like the evidence that we have of theory of mind and how trustworthy that evidence is, how strong it is, and like which species are good candidates for a theory of mind, etc. And then you can sort of like map out how extended you can expect the concept of death to be. So it's a different kind of way of approaching the question than how a scientist would be. And the idea is for this process, if it's done well, the idea is for it to deliver like a series of predictions that scientists can then like pick up and work with empirically. Because I don't do empirical work myself, even though sometimes I collaborate with scientists, but I'm a philosopher, so I work with like thoughts, and so but my work, because it engages a lot with the science, can also like deliver concrete predictions that then the scientists can pick up.
I love it. It's like I'm seeing massive parallels with like theoretical and experimental physics.
Yeah.
This idea of like, okay, string theory, like I don't really think we can ever prove that. Maybe we could, I don't know. But if string theory existed, these would be the presuppositions, these would be the models, this is how the math would work out. And then the experimentalists are the ones who are like looking at different subatomic particles and trying to measure them and trying to understand what they do. And then sometimes it supports and sometimes it refutes these like big theories that were described, because we don't always have the right tools, right? Like we can't dive into a brain of an animal. We can't just ask them. That would be great. And we can't dive into their brain and go like, oh, look, this is lighting up here. That means they understand their own death. It just doesn't really work that way.
No, absolutely. And also with this topic, it's especially hard because, like, how do you even go about studying it ethically? Like, it's very, very hard. Like, we definitely, like, we can observe animals in the wild. And I definitely think that we should be monitoring, like, animals' behavior surrounding death, even if they don't seem immediately, like, relevant. Maybe like an animal just abandoning a corpse might not seem irrelevant, but I think it's important to also note that down, because it can tell us something about how the animal is processing that phenomenon. um, so there's that, but like in the lab, it's very, very hard to study it ethically, because obviously you can't like kill an animal to see how others are going to react. So there are some approaches, but there are not that many studies in the lab. And I've actually, in my work, I've suggested that we could approach this with the use of artifacts, because artifacts are like bodies in that they have a functionality, and they can also like break down irreparably, which is what I think death at its core is, irreversible loss of functionality. And we use this metaphor a lot, right? We say my computer died, my car died.
So what do you mean by artifacts?
Yeah, so like man-made objects that the animal can use to um like it can interact with to get some sort of reward. Like it can be a puzzle box, it can be a touch screen, or it can even be like a robot or something like that. The idea is to train the animal to use this artifact in a way to get a reward, and then for that artifact to break down during the test and see if the animal can realize what just happened and find an alternative solution.
Oh, what a fascinating concept. And I hate to bring this up, it's so cheesy, but I'm taken back to, uh, I was like on a date recently and somebody asked me if I remember, like, what was the earliest thing I remembered? And one of my earliest memories was like the saddest memory of having this balloon that I was really excited by and then it popping on the bushes in front of my house and feeling this just intense feeling of loss, you know, that like this balloon pop and like that is kind of an early approximation of death, is it not?
I mean, I would say that it shows that you at least have some of the cognitive prerequisites for understanding death, in that you are at least grasping the irreversibility of what just happened, right? And that's what made it so tragic. Like, I cannot go back. The balloon isn't coming back. I mean, I get that. I get that love. I get that feeling. So it's not about like traumatizing the animals, but like rather finding out whether they can grasp this notion of irreversible non-functionality.
That's a
And we've
cool
actually
paradigm.
yeah, we've been actually implementing it with Goffin's cockatoos and at the Messerly Research Institute. And the papers are still like under like work in progress, so I can't really talk about the details, but the idea is, yeah, these are animals, the Goffin's cockatoos. They can use tools and they can fix tools when the tools are reversibly non-functional. Like for instance, if you give them a twig to access a piece of cashew that's behind a mesh, but the twig has like little leaves on it, so it can't go through the mesh. They know that they have to peel the leaves off. So that is already like understanding it's non-functional, but it's reversibly non-functional. Like we can make it functional. So the idea was like, well, can we put them in a situation where the tool cannot be fixed and then see what they do. And obviously this only gives us like a very indirect way of approximating the question. We're not getting direct evidence of a concept of death, but I think we are getting some insight into whether or not they have the cognitive prerequisites. And I would pair this with like tests of animacy detection. Like, can they distinguish animate from inanimate beings? Can they like develop expectations about the typical behaviors of beings in their surroundings? Can they distinguish biological from non-biological movement and so on? Like, all of these things inform a concept of life, and in turn inform a concept of death, because in the end death is like the irreversible absence of life.
Yeah. It's a really interesting sort of like bottom up approach to tackling these fundamental questions. And I'm interested too because obviously you had mentioned that a lot of experimentalists, or maybe we should say like observational scientists, like naturalists who just observe animal behavior in the wild or in captivity, that they will publish about death behaviors. And of course, you're not ignoring that literature. So how do you approach the death behavior literature? You know, an animal dies and these other animals are observed to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, so I really like to. I mean, I would say like I have like two kinds of ways of reading this literature. Like on the one hand, I am interested in, as I said, like what words are the scientists using to describe it? How are they analyzing the data? Like, are there any hidden presuppositions? Is there any hidden anthropocentrism, which is very common, and so on? So I'm interested in that kind of like meta analysis, but I'm also interested in like the data themselves. Like, I think like part of the problem for me is that like so much of the current literature is focused on looking for grief in animals. And I think this is a big problem because I mean, it's not a big problem in the sense that it is an important topic. So absolutely, we should be studying it. But if we want to find out whether animals can understand death, then looking solely at grief is only going to give us like a very small part of the picture, you know, because like grief is just one possible emotional reaction to death, but um, it's not the only possible emotional reaction to death. You can, I mean, we all experience this all the time. Whenever we hear that some famous person died, we don't we don't grieve that person's death, but we do understand it.
Yeah, and we may be fascinated by it too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I mean, I'm just talking about like the fact that you can understand it. Like when Amy Winehouse died, we all understood she wouldn't be producing any more songs because she was dead, right? We understood this. But in addition to that, there can be many different kinds of emotional reactions to the news that someone has died, right? You can be happy if you've inherited a large amount of money, or you can be, I don't know, you can be fearful if this means that there is, you know, some danger in the environment, or you can be totally indifferent if you don't care about that person. So these are not reactions that are usually very politically correct. And so we don't usually admit to feeling any other emotion except sadness upon someone's death, but they're certainly possible.
And just like basic curiosity. I think that's probably, I don't want to say it's probably universal, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's, I don't know if you want to call that an emotion, but something that's often observed with animals is just curiosity around death.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an affective state, right? I wouldn't necessarily call that emotion either, but it is some sort of affective state, and it's definitely motivating their behavior. And we see that a lot. We see what looks like curiosity a lot. But this focus on grief has made, I think, like certain contexts being ignored. Like, for instance, violence in nature. I think violence is like a very, very important learning context for animals to acquire a concept of death. Um, Things like infanticide, you know, coalitional attacks, but also the context of predation, which is an extremely common phenomenon and which provides, you know, daily learning opportunities for many animals, you know, to think about death. So, so you know, my point with all this is that I do look at the data and what the data says, and sometimes the data says really interesting things, but I'm also thinking about the data that I would like to have and I don't have because of these presuppositions that are operating in the debate, like, you know, scientists really wanting to find evidence of grief and so ignoring these other very important contexts.
Yeah, I'm reminded of there's a researcher named Kaylee Swift who I've done some work with
Yeah,
in the past, and yeah,
yeah, I
so
know
like
her. Yeah.
these cool studies where she put like a taxidermied crow on the ground that looked dead, probably didn't smell dead, so there might have been a flag there, but like and observed just like interesting behaviors, like necrophilic behaviors, and just really cool things. Like what is going on here? Um, it's sort of that halfway point between just naturalistic observation and experimentation, which I think is there's probably kind of more to be pulled from that. But I want to come back to one other thing that you mentioned, which is this sort of obsession, maybe not obsession, but this bias around grief. And I find it in my own work too when I communicate with people about what I do for a living. And I tell them I'm a psychologist in a cancer center, but I specialize in like existential suffering and end of life. And then they're like, "Oh, it's so important. Like when my dad died, I really needed somebody to talk to." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm not a grief counselor. Like that's not what I do. I work with folks who are dying." And to me, that's another component that I think is so interesting. We often think about death and we look at what happens after death, but we don't think about the process of dying and how that might evoke certain evidences or certain descriptions of an understanding of death. That the dog who walks away from everybody to go into the woods to die, does he understand he's dying? Like, these are interesting questions to me as well.
I mean, that sort of question has been posed to me a lot as well. I tend to think that animals who go on their own to die um, are usually, like, for me, the most plausible explanation is they just don't feel well and they just want to be
Yeah.
alone
Yeah.
because they're feeling shitty and they just want. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't say that word.
No, you can say it.
Okay. They're feeling crappy and they just want to be, away from others. I think, in fact, like, even being wanting to be alone might actually be more of a sign that you don't understand that you're going to die, because then you might seek out social support if you do understand it.
Possibly, but I would also challenge, just from my own research. It's an interesting question, and you could very well be right. But at least in actively dying, as opposed to preparing for death, over days or weeks, when the actively dying person is experiencing the final stages of death, it has not been uncommonly observed that a patient, for example, will wait until everybody leaves the room to finally die. And on the flip side, you will sometimes see that they'll wait for certain people to arrive to die. So there is, there's a lot of question, I think, in the human literature about how much control we actually have over those final, hours and moments.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's really fascinating. Like, I don't really know the literature on human end of life experiences and so on, because I've been very focused on animals, because I think that the like I'm interested in how they learn about death, and I think that humans learn about death in a very different way from the way that animals do. Insofar, like, for, like, generalizing, of course, but insofar as animals, I mean, if we assume that they cannot communicate linguistically about death, they're going to learn about it solipsistically. So it's going to be like their own experiences determining how, like, the knowledge that they have. And so, for instance, they might, like, I think it's going to be relatively easy for animals to acquire a concept of death that incorporates some notion of the things that can cause death, and the notion that if, their peers were to encounter these things, they might die. But it might be harder for them to make the leap to understanding that they themselves could also die. But I think, like, an even harder leap is the understanding that it's inevitable. I think some animals might grasp that they can die, but the idea that they will die is really hard. And I think humans have this idea because we've been told, because we haven't, like, I don't have any real hard evidence that I'm going to die. I've just been told.
Right, because if you just look at the time slot that you are in and the observations you've made, some people die, but some don't.
Exactly. and
Yeah.
and and animals, they have to operate on the basis of that time slot. So their inductive base is going to be very limited. They don't have, like, the wisdom of previous generations, that which is where we get this knowledge that we're going to die. And then, so that's on the one hand. But then I also, like, I have the intuition, and this is, I have to say, speculation, but I do have the intuition that it might be easier for animals to understand the irreversible nature of death than it is for humans, because of how they learn about death. Because for most humans, at least, weird humans, the way we learn about death is, because we watch Bambi or The Lion King, and then we're like, oh, what happened to Bambi's mother? What happened to Mufasa? And then our parents explain, or, like, our grandmother dies, but it's like this, like, thing in the distance where, like, grandma died, and it's human children find it quite hard to grasp the reversibility of death, because, like, you can watch Bambi again and then the mother will be back alive, or, like, grasping that you're never going to see grandma again is really hard. And it might be easier for animals because they have the corpse in front of them.
Yeah, it's something I often talk about even in this work, is how important it is to be to observe death, that we've sort of, in the Western world, only since, like, I don't know, the last maybe 150 years, we have really medicalized death, and we whisk the body away, or we embalm the body to make it look like it's alive. Like, we need to observe the changes that occur after death. It gives us a sense of finality, and we don't often have that opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, you can see it in how people theorize about death. Like, I've seen researchers saying things like understanding death requires the concept of absence. It's an abstract
Oh,
concept. And I'm
interesting. They
like,
don't say, like, decomposition or
exactly,
that's
exactly,
fascinating.
exactly. And it's like, of course you think it's absence, because what happens when someone in our world dies? They just take him away, and like all of a sudden he's not there. And you have to like grasp that somehow, that they're never going to appear again. And if you're seeing the body in front of you decomposing, rotting, etc., and like day after day not moving, I think it's going to be much easier to grasp this notion.
Or even seeing the body, because this is something we also don't see very often. I think it has happened in human societies, and it's always seen as this, like, taboo thing, but, like, the body being devoured. Like, after death, the body, this understanding that that is no longer, an active being,
Yeah.
now that is
Yeah.
fuel, right? And, like, 'cause you see cannibalism within species pretty
Yeah. Yeah. I
commonly.
mean, and also like you see scavengers coming in and taking the body. I mean, you see it in animals. There are some reports where the family members are, or the group members are trying to protect the body from the scavengers, you know.
Interesting.
So that, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, that really marks a difference, between how we learn and how they learn about death.
Yeah, how we learn and how we shape society, like, with intentionality, I think, which is a major difference, because I can't help but see the parallel whenever I have researchers on who talk about climate change and talk about sort of recycling and all of the scams around recycling and just the way that we conceive of consumptive extractive practices. One of the common themes we always get to is this concept of away. Like, I just throw things away and then they go away. And not like, when this goes into this bag, it's taken in this bucket to this area where it sits in a pile of things. And, we just don't, I think and it's the same thing with the way that we treat our animals as food. I know, going back to some of the concepts that we were talking about at the top of the hour, the more separate we are, the more that we don't have to kind of see how the sausage is made, the easier it is to imagine it, I guess, a little bit sterilized and a little bit either here and then not here.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you know the work of Melanie Joy, but she's been talking about, all these mechanisms by which we come to see meat eating as normal, natural, and necessary. And part of it is this idea of like referring to the things as like sausages, pork, beef, rather than, the remains of an individual animal with like a mental life, which was cut short and, suffered a lot and so on. And like, all this meat is handed to us in these packages where like there's not a drop of blood and everything looks super pristine and everything. And yeah, I mean, it's funny how human beings think of themselves as so super smart, and then we're like so easily fooled by these kind of tricks, right?
And, like, we wanna be, like, we're knowingly fooled because it's more comfortable. I often see, you think, a lot of things we think on a lot of times we think on a dialectic, we think on kind of a continuum, and many people think of, like, veganism way over here, and then they think of, like, let's say, hunting behavior way over here. But very often I see a lot of parallels between a subsistence farmer and conservation hunter, for example, and somebody who lives a vegan lifestyle. Like, both of them are actually confronting the reality of how meat is captured or killed and consumed, and they're engaging. They're either choosing to engage with that or they're choosing to not engage with that. But most of us in the middle are the ones who are just, like, duping ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right.
That's fascinating. So I'm curious here as we're sort of wrapping up the hour if because we haven't actually talked about too many specific examples, and I would love to hear about maybe some of your favorite examples of maybe behaviors or knowledge that you've gleaned and how you have interpreted that or kind of approached it philosophically.
Mhm. So I think one of the most interesting cases, or one that really stuck with me, it came out as I was finishing the original manuscript, because the book came out in 2021 in Spanish, and now there's an updated and revised edition that's coming out in English. Um, and this was a case that was published, a super super tragic case of an albino chimp, which was born into a community that has very high infanticide rates. And albinism is an extremely rare condition in chimpanzees. This was only the second known case. um, so, chimpanzee mothers, when they give birth, they tend to go away from the group because of this risk of infanticide. So, when the mother came back to the group with her baby, all the chimpanzees went crazy. They started alarm calling, their fur was standing on end. They were just absolutely terrified of this individual that she was carrying. Like, they didn't know what it was, and they were doing all these alarm calls for like potentially dangerous animals. And at some point the alpha male grabbed the baby chimp, and they killed him in like no time. Which is of course like really heartbreaking, but it's also very interesting how the behavior of the group radically changed once the baby was dead. All of a sudden they all like gave into their curiosity, and they gathered around the corpse, and they started like poking at it, sniffing it, pulling on its hair, and like comparing it to their own. Um, so for me, this is like a super interesting piece of evidence, because it suggests very strongly that the chimpanzees understood that because the baby was dead, he was no longer dangerous. Whatever that creature was, that weird creature that smelled of chimpanzee but looked so different, whatever it was no longer dangerous. And this, to me, suggests that they can understand at least what I call the minimal concept of death, which is this idea that individuals don't do the things that living individuals can do, and that this is an irreversible state. So when the baby was alive, it could hurt them, but when it was dead, it couldn't. So that was like a super fascinating case.
Is there anything that goes beyond that minimum concept of death? Do you have any examples of something that you think of as like maybe more, I don't want to, I'm so careful of my language now, like sophisticated. I hate that, but no, or higher order or more complex. I don't know.
I mean, it's very difficult to say, because of course the scientists haven't been operating with my theory, and so like they've been, for the most part, often they've been looking for like a full-blown human adult concept of death. And usually they're just saying we can't find that, which is unsurprising. But like there is some, like there is evidence that at least they understand, like a lot of animals understand which things are dangerous. Like to go back to chimpanzees, which like unfortunately, because of like also this anthropocentric bias, a lot of the literature is on primates, and specifically great apes. But chimpanzees, for instance, they have been seen dismantling snares, and also like road crossing in a very careful way. So like and also like cleaning each other's wounds and things like that. So they do have like some understanding of which things are dangerous. Um, but of course, like it's difficult to think about how, like, what kind of evidence um, could we get for the idea that they understand, say, the causality behind death. So, one example that I also wanted to mention, because I also think is like a really good piece of evidence, is the behavior that gives title to the book, right? Playing possum. So this is like the behavior, death feigning. So the opossum, when she feels threatened, she goes into this very elaborate death display where she like stops responding to the world, and like she adopts the bodily and facial expression of a corpse. Her bodily functions are reduced, so her temperature drops, her breathing and heart rate drop, and she secretes this like putrid smelling liquid from her glands, and so she becomes a corpse, right? And it's a very, very convincing display. And the reason why it gives title to my book is not because I think that the opossum herself understands what she's doing. I think this is probably an automatic reaction, analogous to when we, like when our pupils dilate because we have fear or whatever. However, if this behavior has evolved, and if it has evolved in the complexity that it has, where it's like made up of all these heterogeneous components that are hanging together and occurring as part of the same defense mechanism, we need to postulate some selection pressure which will have given shape to it as it is. And that selection pressure is going to be the concept of death of the deceived predators.
Oh, right.
So the idea is
So
that
they think it's dead, so they no longer have to kill it.
Exactly. And so for them to be fooled, the display has to be convincing, right? And so this behavior, like this concept of death has like shaped this behavior insofar as, if they didn't find it convincing, then they would eat the opossum, and then that opossum would have it more difficult to reproduce. So the ones who are more convincing were more likely to pass on their genes, etc. And you get like a more and more convincing display over generations. And what is interesting, so my book is called Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death. And like the subtitle is also important because I think that this playing possum behavior shows us how animals understand death, insofar as like all these components are telling us something. They're telling us like the predators think that dead individuals feel cold, stop responding, smell bad, take on this facial expression, whatever, like we know these things. And also, like, some of it can suggest that they have some understanding of also the causality behind death. So I think it shows us, like, this death feigning behavior shows us that what they understand that dead individuals do not do, and what they also understand that dead individuals do. So they start smelling a certain way, or they adopt a certain facial expression and so on. But also, not in the case of the opossum specifically, but in the case of certain snakes, like for instance the hognose snake, the death display is also accompanied by two very interesting things. One is blood secretions from the mouth. So the snakes will like lie belly up with their mouth open and their tongue extended, and like showing no signs of breathing, no signs of responding to the world. And they will often secrete blood from their mouths, which, like also tells us that maybe is a hint that the predators also like associate this state with violence and with the blood that comes with violence. But also, interestingly, what I find super fascinating about these hognose snakes is that before they do the death display, first they do a dying display. So first they start like writhing erratically, like they're dying, and then they do the death display. So this also tells us, something about like, this understanding that the dying comes before.
You're right. Yeah, the sort of chronology of death.
Exactly, the chronology of death, and how it's not something that just like that just pops out of nowhere, but like something happens to the body.
it's also interesting that in both of these cases, like one has this blood display, one has this putrid smell, that there's almost an indication to the potential predator, like, I'm already dead, but also I'm not worth eating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like something like either I'm too far gone, I'm decomposed, you could get sick from eating me, or like something violent happened, or maybe I died from like something dangerous, and that sort of observational, like writhing around and stuff like, oh, let's not get near that guy. Cause I think there's the one, I'm no longer a threat to you. So you don't need to try and kill me in like some sort of defense. But number two, you would think, right, that an already dead prey animal would be easy pickings, but a lot of animals aren't scavengers.
Exactly. Exactly. But also, I mean, it would be easy pickings, but also like the predator might not be hungry at that exact moment. She might just like have hunted down this prey because she was there, and but she might cache it for later consumption. So playing dead is also an advantage there. And also some scientists have also postulated that this might be analogous to a startle response. So the idea is the animal is going very, very rapidly and very suddenly from alive and well to dead and decomposing, which could also function by like just weirding out the predator. Like predators are also kind of cowardly. Like hunting down prey is dangerous as well, and they will like be wary of anything that looks weird or dangerous, and so this could also function as a kind of like weirding out strategy. But for that to work, you also need like the predator to understand, oh wait, like it was alive and now it's dead, like what is this, what's going on?
Right, yeah. It's like it's the element of surprise, but that doesn't work if they don't understand that. So, oh, that's fascinating. Oh my gosh, there's such a richness here. And I'm curious, kind of last question that I'm coming up with, but I will ask if there's anything else that you want to make mention of. How much of the book, which is obviously a book for sort of it's a trade publication, right, for public consumption, how much of that came directly from your um your academic publications, and how much, had you already been publishing on this and then you decided, oh, I should just compile a lot of this, or was this sort of an endeavor in and of itself?
No, I had been researching the topic for a while, and I had already some academic publications on it. And then I was approached by a Spanish press who commissioned me to write a trade book. And at this time, I don't know why, but I decided to say yes, even though it's a terrible idea for a postdoc on the job market to write a trade book in Spanish. Like, I cannot imagine a worse way to spend your time. But for some reason, I found it a very appealing project. Maybe because it was the pandemic, my dog had died. Maybe like I needed something that would bring me some joy. I know it sounds paradoxical that a book on death would bring me joy, but
No,
but
I
like
get it.
thanks, I thought you would appreciate. But like for me, like this idea of trying to put my research into words that anyone could understand what felt like a fun challenge. And the book was really written thinking of my family and friends, and like it's filled with silly jokes, Easter eggs for them to find, a lot of very silly, very silly jokes and anecdotes and stuff like that, because I was having fun writing it, and I wanted the reader to have fun reading it, especially because it's a topic that a lot of people struggle with a lot. And um for us, probably for you and me, because we've been thinking about this for so long and in such depth, we lose sight of the fact that a lot of people really struggle with it. And for me, definitely, it's happened to me that I've been at a dinner party and someone asked me about my research, and I like go off on a little tangent, and then I suddenly realize that everyone is looking super depressed because of what I just said. um so so I wanted the book to be fun, and I'm so happy with the cover that Princeton University got for the book, because it's pink, which is, I find amazing. Like a pink book on death is very unusual. And it looks like a fun book from the cover. And I love that because I wrote it wanting it to be a fun book. And so far, like, for the most part, people have found it fun, and people have been surprised at finding a book about death to be fun. Um, so yeah, it was a fun project, and it worked out. It was a terrible decision to write it, but it worked out
It worked
because
out.
like it's gotten a lot of attention, and I'm getting all these opportunities because I wrote this book, and so I'm really glad I did it, even though I wouldn't recommend it to someone on the job market.
But I do have to really reflect back to you that it is a skill, not just your ability to write in such a way that is, um, somewhat lighter, somewhat funnier, and just like comfortable and understandable for a non-academic audience. But even just talking to you over this hour, it's very clear that you have this, and I don't know if it's innate or if you've worked your ass off at it, but either way, it's paid off. This ability to communicate complicated philosophical concepts in a way that's really understandable, because philosophy can get very dense and wonky and a bit esoteric very quickly. And I didn't feel that for a second through this.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that compliment because it is something that, like, I do work hard to reach that level of communication, and it is so important for me because I want people to. I think philosophy is so important for so many things, for science and for us, and for for reflecting on the world and the current situation and everything. And I want people to like philosophy. That is very important to me. And so it is important to write and to communicate in a way that makes philosophy sound understandable and illuminating.
Ah, well, you have done an incredible job. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing all of your insights with us, and thanks for writing the book. Everybody, the book is Playing Possum: How Animals Understand Death by Dr. Susana Monsó. I did
That's
it.
right. Thank you so much. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Of course, and everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.